Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Chuck Mason. And today we're delighted to welcome Bill Howard. Welcome, Bill. Bill's he's gotten interested in genealogy, especially genetics, and he's going to be talking to us somewhat about some of the testing, different kinds of tests. And you're most interested, I gather, in the Y chromosome. That's what you like to follow up.
Yes.
And you're interested in much more than just general genealogy, but patterns of migration and
migration, timing, how long ago your most recent common ancestor lived with someone else, that sort of
thing.
I
think that's what most of us want to find out when or we're trying to connect with our most recent common ancestor. But in some cases that Y goes much, much further back before we can find it. What other kinds of tests are there besides the Y?
The Y was one of the first, and then the mitochondrial DNA followed very shortly, or was produced at about the same time.
But that tells you even less. I mean, that changes even less, doesn't it?
The resolution is not as good. You can jump a number of thousands of years, but you don't, it goes up the mother's line, and you can tell from those lines roughly what part of, say, Europe your ancestry was from, but you can't trace it in detail like you can for the male line of the Y.
Mine tells me I'm M, so that's out of Africa. So I haven't changed in thousands of years. It was really worthless as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, the Y DNA test came first along with the mitochondrial. And more recently, there is a test for autosomal DNA.
Now, that's what everybody seems to be talking about these days.
And if you look at that, the Y test goes up the father's line. Yeah. The X test goes up the mother's line. That's the mitochondrial. Right. And now autosomal will fill in that gap from you out to maybe fifth or sixth cousin. Mm-hmm. And it's very good in determining your relationships within the first, second, third cousin. And beyond that, it gets a little bit more murky, but it still gives you information. The Y chromosome acts on one of the 23 chromosomes in the human system. Mm-hmm. The X is another one. Those are the ones that are most interesting for genealogy. But the autosomal is looking at all of the 23 chromosomes. And what it will do is to look at, for example, you want to compare yourself with someone else. Both of those tests have to be available, and you have to give permission to share your test results with someone else.
And that's true of any of the companies, too.
That's true.
They're not going to just...
And so what it will do is to give you some indication of the commonality of where on each chromosome your little sequence agrees with someone else's little sequence. And that can give you a lot more information. And one of the powers of this is that you're not going up a Y line, which has typically the same surname, but it will fill in a lot of surnames in between, because from you out to the fifth cousins, there are a lot of surnames that come in.
Yeah, there's one disadvantage to that, and and that's if you're from any kind of a group where there's been a lot of intermarriage. It sort of makes things fuzzy. It makes it seem like you're much more closely related than your paper documentation will show, because you can get the same thing from your mother's side and from your father's side, because they might have been even second cousins and not known about it.
That's the case with my wife and with me. Both of our parents were third cousins.
Oh, okay, so you'll run into some of that already.
Oh, yes.
Did they know it when they got married? Do you know?
Yes, they did in both cases. But in my looking at the ancestry of my cousin, she married a fellow who, and it turns out they are fifth cousins, and they didn't know about it.
But I think this, you've got to remember that a few hundred years ago, there was a much smaller population.
Yes.
Certainly among Jews, first cousin marriages are perfectly okay. And what surprised me as I became a genealogist was that uncle-niece marriages were okay. Uh-huh. So, I mean, look at how closely your DNA is going to match from both sides if you have that, and you have it not only one time, but you have it over generations.
Yes.
And that really complicates things in a, what do I call it, a small group.
And early on, we didn't really have the population or the opportunities for people to really meet. The standard in genealogy, if you don't know where the bride or the groom came from, draw a circle, and where a horse can travel in a day's time, you're probably going to find the family. So it makes sense that we would have so many close relationships.
But yet it seems to work for the general population.
Well, one thing that I don't think very many people know is that as you go back in time, you're widening out the population. But by the time you get back to about 13 generations, it starts to close up again.
It's got to. Yeah. So we're all. What did they say? We're all related to one Adam and one Eve to begin with. I mean, not the biblical Adam and Eve, but the one man from about 90,000 years and a woman from 150,000 or something.
Oh yes.
Well,
we're beginning also to find from the DNA that a large number of people, particularly in the United States with European origins, have a little bit of Neanderthal.
Yes, I've been reading that too. That's what's very interesting.
and people get surprised. I was just talking to a friend who she's had her husband's DNA done, and as far as he knew, they were solid German all the way back. Well, lo and behold, there's a little bit of Norwegian, and he just couldn't understand it till she started explaining history and telling them, they didn't stay in Norway. They early on they were going out and battling in other places, and were in Germany and Denmark and all of that area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Now, do you want to talk a little bit about what do the different companies give you? Because different companies give you the information on your general ancestry like that.
Yeah. The one that it has probably the largest database is Family Tree DNA. And that's the one that specializes in, in the Y chromosome, the father's line. And if you give permission to share, they will post that on a website that everybody can see. Most of these places also, the testing agencies give you a website address so that with a password you can see what your results are. And if you have permission to share with other people, they will often make an inquiry of you, and then you can not only compare your DNA result, but you can compare your pedigrees. And the real plus factor in doing the DNA testing is that if you have a fairly well-developed pedigree, you can extend that often because the DNA will give you hints as to who you are related with that may have pedigrees that have been chased back further in time. And so you can share pedigrees based on your DNA result. And that means that you can break down what genealogists often call brick walls.
Now with the test, do you have, like with the Y chromosome, you have different markers? You can test so many markers. Do they have different ones, or are they testing a set number?
It started out with 11 marker test.
Okay.
But that didn't give you very good resolution. So they went then from 11 to 25, 12 to 25. And then the most standard one now that most people take is 37 markers. But you pay a little bit more and you can get 67. You pay a little bit more and you can get 111.
Well, I've heard it said, at least it said, my husband insists that he's not going to get very much more than, he says the 37 is the best one, because after that it really doesn't help very much. I don't know enough to say yes or no on that.
I recently heard somebody else say that you should go with the 60. What was it, 63? 67 markers, but they didn't really have a whole lot of explanation as to why they thought it was a better test.
Well, I think the answer to that is that if you start out at 37, that is the least cost for the most information. Then if you find that you may be related to somebody else that looks like the 37 is matched with them, both can go to 67. That gives you a little higher resolution, and you have more information, and you can tell better how close your relationship is liable to be.
Now, the ones with the higher ones, are those markers that change more often?
Not necessarily. When the markers were picked to begin with, the attitude was we want the more information that we can get out of the marker set that we pick. And in some cases, it will show closer relationships. Those are ones where the marker mutations will be the highest. And so, and then you can pick a different set that goes perhaps a little further back in time. But the more markers you have, the more resolution you have. And that seems to be working very well. You pay a little bit for the 37. You can upgrade it because they keep the sample. And so you pay a little bit more money and you go up, up, up. Yeah.
But the number that you have done on also depends on the haplogroup. And a group, let's define haplogroup. It's a bunch of people that belong together or matched their haplotype, which is the individual.
Yeah, take my surname, Howard. If you look at the reporting, there will be a lot of so-called R1Bs. Mm-hmm. Those typically come from Western Europe, England, and so on. And a lot of the immigrants to the United States are the R1B. But you can have other groups of people. For example, the Jewish group is a J.
Yeah.
And so you can find some mixtures of haplogroups amongst the people with the same surname. For example, the Vikings in Scandinavia swooped down onto England, did a little bit of conquering, married.
Raped the women. And
those are haplogroup I. So in particular, if you go north in England where the Vikings tended to come down, usually around the coast, you can find I haplogroups mixed with the R1B haplogroups. And so those tell you that you are in a different set. And so if you're trying to find common ancestors, you look at your own haplogroup and you will find the most recent common ancestors among those members of your same haplogroup. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say that if you go back further in time, you have the intermarriages between the R's and the I's. Yeah.
Well, I think you find that with everything, and I guess what surprises me somewhat is the diversity and how much people actually. We tend to think if you're going by horse and buggy or not even horse and just walking, how far the different groups migrated. I mean, the Jays are around the Mediterranean, yet they're up in Europe because the Jews went up there, they went to Russia, they went, they're all over the place, and yet the Jays are generally Semitic people to begin with, all around the Mediterranean, and yet they got everywhere else.
But you're looking at time scales. If you take a time scale of about 100 years, because the only interaction was ox cart and horse, they tended to intermarry within a day's run. But if you give this an extension over hundreds of years, you have this migration that has happened. And that's the reason why the J haplogroup, for example, they were distributed along the Silk Road, the Middle East, and so on.
And then you have the Q, which is another haplogroup.
Yes.
And they're the American Indians, and yet they're also found in Europe. So somebody traveled a whole lot to get somewhere. Who knows? Maybe they started out before they got to Europe and went east to Europe, and some went or east through Asia to the U.S. to the American continents, and also west to Europe. I mean, I think it's fascinating how they've done all of that. But let's get back to a little bit closer to genealogy rather than thousands of years ago.
Okay.
23andMe gives you a lot of dots and dashes, or lots of information without really interpreting the health stuff. They still send you all the numbers, but they don't tell you anything about it anymore. Is that correct?
About the health aspects, no.
Yeah.
The Food and Drug Administration came down in November, I think it was of 2013,
Yeah.
and said you ought not to do this. Now, there's been a lot of discussion between 23andMe about how they might do it again. But if you get your results from 23andMe, there are organizations that you can send your results to, and they can tell you a little bit about the health aspects of this.
Yeah, I know there's one that'll just tell you, and again, he doesn't want to get into trouble, so he just says, why don't you read about this or this?
Yeah.
And without, but I think it's, it's your own body. I think you have a right to know what you've got. So I guess that's a big controversy.
The controversy is there. I can understand FTDA's point of view, and that is people that are unfamiliar with it can misinterpret it.
Yeah.
And so they would like to see your physician's intervention in somehow. But those discussions are still going on right now.
Yeah, okay, I didn't realize that there was, I guess they just stopped it before people started panicking too much, or you see that you have.
One of the neat things about some of these testing agencies, like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, is that once you get your results, you can send it via an email attachment into places called GEDmatch or YSearch. And what they will do is to take all this information, put it together, and then analyze this and tell you what your matches might be.
Okay, they're just doing the genealogy. They'll discard all of these.
Yeah, they're looking
things
at family trees, for example.
I
And
guess
if
the
your family-
23andMe does that more than.
Yeah, if your family tree looks a lot like this one,
Yeah.
or you have surnames that overlap, they'll give you a trigger, and you can begin to look into that in more detail. Not only that, but they can tell you whose tree it is, and if you have agreed to share information, you can contact them and work either online or offline with them.
I think one of the things we should stress is that when you do send your stuff, or when it is online, it's not there with your name. You get some kind of a contact, you send it, and family tree, for instance, you send it to them, and they will forward it to you, and it's up to the person who receives it to say yes.
Yes. Yes.
I just happened to get a message, not necessarily dealing with genetics, but hello, I'm from the town of Wiesbaden, and with the archives there, and I noticed you have family from there. Send me your information, I can tell you what you have. I thought, oh, how wonderful. I mean, he had no idea how to reach me, and there was no way to reach me except through that.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's really nice. I really hesitate to have my whole family out there I mean, this is I'm the minority on that these days.
Well, I'm with you with that. I hear the horror stories of things that people do with information people have put out there, and I caution people to really be careful what they put out.
But I really haven't heard of any really bad cases where somebody has stolen identity using the genealogy end of it.
Oh, I really don't think that there's a real way of stealing identity. I mean, I've talked about this in the past. It's, just people taking information, changing things, and then presenting it that you put it out there, and things along those lines that do happen. And so I'm very hesitant.
After the first Y DNA and the mitochondrial DNA came out, then the big step was the autosomal. Now there's been another big step, and that's called the big Y. You can, at a fairly substantial price right now, get tested through the big Y part of family tree DNA. Now what happens there, Chuck mentioned and you mentioned the existence of haplogroups. Mm-hmm. The haplogroups can be subdivided, and the subdivisions of those are called subclades. Mm-hmm. And these subclades have a special name called SNPs. I won't go into that. But people are now taking the SNPs and putting them in a time order. And so as you get more recent SNPs, those are ones where the mutations have occurred more recently. And if you share that kind of SNP with somebody else, then you're more closely related.
Yeah,
So the big Y is a fairly substantial leap forward. And then there's even rumors of more resolution going on in the X chromosome world, which is a male and a female carry the X,
Yeah.
and only the female, let's see,
Female has two.
female has two.
Those two combine and pass on, and you have one from the father. So
Yes.
you could perhaps find something about your grandmother on your father's side through that.
Yeah. But I don't know anything more about the X, just that they're beginning to look into it.
But again, the more, when you look at, and I know in Sid's group, which is a little bit different, he's been able to determine when the mutations took place by looking at it. Everybody in his group has an 8 in location 455, so he knows that has to have happened earlier. And then he'll look at 2 other things, and he'll look at more and see what are the, when other mutations. Anyway, he's been able to figure it out, and I guess there are a couple of different methods that I don't want to go into because they're really mathematical,
Yeah.
a lot of statistics with it, that you could figure out approximately how many hundreds of years ago that something like that happened. But I think it's fascinating that you can do all of
We
that.
talked about the resolution of the X chromosome, that is the mother's line, as being very flaky. You only have 1,000-year increments. In the case of the Y, it's much tighter. For example, you can determine a time difference between two people to a couple of 100 years, where there's a 50% probability that you'll hit it right on one side or the other of the couple of 100 years. And that makes it a very powerful tool in conjunction with what you know about the pedigrees and the genealogy part.
You've talked about a couple of companies. Are there more companies that are still doing the testing, or?
Well, we've talked about Family Tree DNA. We've talked about 23andMe. The third one that we haven't mentioned very much is Ancestry.com. That one is an annual subscription possibility. I have found it to be very useful in what I have done. They offer a DNA test, which is like an autosomal test. They will give you the results there. And I think the combination of all of these, particularly when you share that information with places like GEDmatch or YSearch, begins to broaden out your DNA, and therefore presents the opportunity for someone or some computer somewhere doing the comparison, coming back to you and say you ought to contact X or Y because they have information that might be of value to you.
And this would be a different subscription from the one that you can go look at the census and things like that.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true. And Ancestry.com is very good because they post pedigree information. So if you volunteer to share your pedigree, you can see all of this online.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was going to say something and I forgot. I guess so the thing to do is really to join as many groups as possible as that you could possibly fit. Perhaps have yourself tested with more than one company so that you're on that database, and maybe you'll match somebody there who didn't bother to send their things to was it
GEDmatch.
GEDmatch
Yeah,
or
YSearch.
Or YSearch.
Yeah.
But the thing to do if you're really interested in trying to meet other people that you match, to send your things to as many of these as possible.
I think, Arlene, it depends upon how gung-ho you are.
But but why bother having being tested if you don't want to?
Well, that's true. I mean, you're dipping your big toe in the water. And if you like it, you can put the whole foot in.
Yeah, well, I can understand that that 23andMe will have may have many matches that will not contact you because they had the test done for health reasons as opposed to genealogical reasons, and therefore they're not really interested in following the genealogy line at all. I can understand that, but if they had it done with one of the other two, that are really there mainly for the genealogy purposes, I can't understand people not answering you. And you say, hey, I think you're a match. Do you want to answer me?
Yeah.
And you don't get an answer, or don't join the group. And that's confused me.
Well, you know, as a hobby, I understand that genealogy is second only to gardening.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous increase in the use of the internet for these kinds of comparisons and of linking people to other people.
It's almost like it's really a different world from when I started genealogy, when you had to go to the archives, and now you click, 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 and you're there, and you get much of your material.
Sure.
But it's important to remember also that you cannot do everything on the internet yet. Maybe another 100 years.
I don't really think in another 100 years, unless somebody comes up with an awful lot of money. And I've just found things in researching that I don't think 100 years from now it's still going to be online.
But I mean, we found things. I gave a talk once, and somebody said something about having an ancestor, a grandmother that collected Civil War widow's pension. And Sid went to another computer in a different room, and 10 minutes later he had her stuff. Now, who would have thought an application for a widow's pension for Civil War records, would be online? But
yeah.
It's that local organization that happened to put it online. So you're of what you can find.
We know there's been this big explosion in information that has become available. And at one time, this was a number of years ago, and it may still be present now, that is the rate at which you knew your ancestral line going back because of the availability of this information was more rapid than your descendants were being born.
Yeah. I think this has been very interesting, and Bill, I thank you very much for coming. I think it's important that people realize that there are several different testing companies, and there are several different tests, and you really have to look at what you're trying to research, and just then decide which company or both companies or three companies to go with.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you all, and I hope this helps.
Just say.